When it comes to evil, phenomenology begins not with our capacity for meaning-making, but instead with our being incapacitated for such activity. We must consider the logic behind these failures of meaning and give an account of them. In doing so, the phenomenological characteristics of evil's double silence will be rigorously described. To perform a phenomenology of what leaves us in silence does not leave us without recourse to language. Instead, the great difficulty doubtless consists in deciding what silence says. Let us begin by considering other kinds of silences, the silence of God and the silence of love, so we may more adequately conceptualize the distinctive manner evil's double silence speaks to us. The silence of God can be understood in several senses. First, there is the silence of atheism, which does not remain silent itself, but aims to silence discourse about God. Such silence is more appropriately considered a silence of the idol, since what it seeks to silence is not God, but a concept of God, a conceptual idol that reduces God to the limits of human cognition and, more specifically, the horizons available to the atheist. Second, there is the silence that comes when confronting the ineffable, inconceivable, and unnameable. Such silence happens because words fail to capture what exceeds them, what saturates them to their breaking point. Third, there is the silence that remains silent through and for agape. This is a holy silence that knows where it is, whom it silences, and why it must be silent. It puts love into action and recognizes that the only way to respond to God properly is by this manner of being silent. The silence of love converges with the silence of God, unsurprisingly, as God is often identified with love. Yet, in suspending theological considerations, love can be approached as a purely philosophical concept. And it's here where we discover distinct forms of silence associated with it. First, we lack the words to speak it. To even say, "I love you," appears maudlin and devoid of power. We maintain the capacity for speech, of course, but dedicate it to the constant chatter of what we mistakenly call love. Such empty speech is merely a facade for what we lack, and a deficient replacement of the words we lack for speaking of this lack. Next, silence comes from a lack of concepts. We find ourselves philosophically aphasic, unable to identify love in its conceptual unity, and thus unable to distinguish it from other affective dispositions. Finally, the silence comes from a lack of strength. Love demands much from us. It renders us speechless by shining a light upon the inadequacies of our own horizons. It requires a different kind of language that can do justice to it, one that, like the silence in and through agape, calls us out of our complacency and demands that we put love into action rather than merely speak its name. The silence of evil shares several features with these other silences. Like the silence of God, there are those who wish to silence discourse on evil, to rid ourselves of its name, perhaps due to its supposedly metaphysical and theological accoutrements. Like the silence of love, it is a silence resulting from the lack of a philosophical concept proper to evil. For this reason, few philosophers have ventured to address evil in its conceptual unity, seeking a common thread that would unite the different classes of evil discussed in a previous video. As such, evil is treated in a piecemeal fashion, lacking a conceptual unity that would allow us to properly think it. There are also distinct silences originating from evil itself. In fact, it produces a double silence. The first silence is brought about by encountering the ineffable excess that overwhelms words, breaching their power to name the unnameable. It is such an encounter that leaves one speechless, recognizing that we lack the capacity to put words to its traumatic dimension. More than the excess of a saturated phenomenon that overwhelms our words, evil deploys a second silence as well by diminishing speech itself, depleting us of those already inadequate words and concepts from even being uttered. Evil not only resists meaning, but it interrupts and damages the very means for meaning making. As will be discussed later in this work, it is responsible for silencing God and love, replacing them with idols and empty speech. Evil does disturb our complacency, but also deprives us of the means to overcome it and leads us to an even more profound complacency, one brought about by a shrinking horizon of thought, less aware of its limits. It is this second silence, in conjunction with the first, that figures centrally in the phenomenological analyses that follow. Despite seeming to be a contradiction, the history of thought addressing evil demonstrates it by responding to these silences while fleeing from them at the same time. When evil is presented as a radical substance with its own independent reality distinct from the good, we find the first silence of evil affirmed. When evil appears, it arrives as a gratuitous power and not a privation of the good. In contrast, when evil is presented as an absence of the good, a kind of nothingness, we find the second silence affirmed. Here, evil appears in its parasitic form, depriving us of the goods previously available. While both theories ultimately take refuge in metaphysical and theological justifications, both also touch upon a kernel of phenomenological truth that demands further analysis. We must not let ontological concerns prevent us from considering how evil gives itself from itself, even if one adheres to the privative theory. An absence of being does not necessitate an absence of phenomenality. Indeed, some phenomena show themselves most fully when being no longer impedes access to their manifestation. As such, and in considering the latent phenomenological truths embedded in them, this work shall not shy away from incorporating approaches to evil from the history of thought. This is not to affirm the ontological reality of evil, as with substantialist theories, but to pay heed to evil's phenomenological positivity, manifested as the encounter with an excess that appears as more than mere privation. Nor is it to affirm, as with privative theories, the absolute ontological goodness of existence. Instead, it is to affirm that whatever may pass for evil arrives and imposes itself as a kind of negation of life, the loss of possibility, the attenuation of hope, etc. This move is not some furtive attempt to reintroduce metaphysical or theological assumptions. Rather, these disciplines and traditions constitute distinct responses to evil in its manifold givenness. While suspending judgment upon them as theories, they remain valuable for the pre-theoretical origins that support them. Thought must put to itself the problem of the genesis of its own meaning, writes Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In this rereading of the philosophy of evil and its history, we discover points of contact, guiding us as we follow the wake of the trace left behind evil's instantiations, allowing us to discover that primordial context prompting such theorizing in the first place. For even the most inventive speculations, writes Michel Henry this time, are never detached from the phenomena. In the next video, we'll turn to defining the subject matter under investigation, a phenomenology proper to evil, the Thanatonic phenomenon. Thank you for watching. Please share and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment or question down below, and I'll see you next time.